So like when I was as a detective, I'd be like solving murders that I'm committing myself.
This case was never supposed to go this far. At first, it was described as unclear, then limited. In some early statements, even possibly non-criminal. Investigators themselves acknowledged uncertainty, explaining that critical forensic details were sealed and that conclusions could not yet be drawn. But now, that position appears to be changing. According to multiple recent reports, prosecutors are actively considering a murder indictment, an escalation that stands in sharp contrast to how this case was initially framed. What once looked like an unresolved tragedy with unanswered questions is now being re-examined through a much more serious legal lens. At the center of it all is a body discovered long after the fact, a vehicle publicly linked to David, weeks of silence, months of sealed medical findings, and a timeline that, until recently, felt stalled in place. For a long time, the public narrative barely moved. There were no charges, no clear explanations, just fragments of information and repeated reminders that investigators were still waiting on key evidence. So what changed? What new details emerged behind the scenes that caused authorities to reconsider everything they had previously said? And why is that shift happening now, after so much time has already passed? This isn't about speculation, assumptions, or internet theories. It's about following the documented timeline, step by step, and understanding how a case that once appeared legally uncertain reached the point it's at today. Because when you follow the timeline closely, the story no longer looks the way it first appeared. The story begins not with an arrest, but with a disappearance that didn't immediately trigger alarm bells. Celeste Rivas was reported missing, but in the early days, there was no clear indication of what had happened to her or where the situation would ultimately lead. Like many missing person cases, information came in slowly, fragmented, and often without confirmation. For a time, there were more questions than answers and very few concrete facts. That changed when her body was eventually discovered. According to publicly available reports, Celeste Rivas was found inside the trunk of a vehicle. The location of the discovery immediately raised concern, but investigators were careful in how they described the situation. The vehicle was later publicly reported as being connected to David, a detail that intensified media attention and public interest almost overnight. However, despite the shocking nature of that discovery, law enforcement did not immediately classify the death as a homicide. Early statements emphasized uncertainty. Authorities explained that the cause and manner of death had not yet been determined and that key forensic details were still pending. Medical examiner findings were sealed, limiting what could be shared publicly and slowing the pace of definitive conclusions. This uncertainty mattered more than many people realized. Because of the time that had passed between Celeste's disappearance and the discovery of her body, investigators faced significant forensic challenges. Decomposition complicated analysis. Environmental factors added more variables. And without a confirmed cause of death, officials were legally constrained in how they could proceed. As a result, the case did not move forward as a typical criminal investigation would. There were no immediate charges, no public accusations, no definitive statements pointing in one direction or another. Instead, authorities repeatedly stressed patience, explaining that they were waiting on expert evaluations before determining the next steps. To the public, this hesitation was confusing. To investigators, it was necessary. At that stage, the case existed in a gray zone, serious, disturbing, but legally unresolved. Media reports reflected that ambiguity, often using cautious language and avoiding firm conclusions. And that's what makes the next development so significant, because at that point, even investigators didn't know what they were looking at. Once the discovery became public, attention shifted rapidly and inevitably toward one name, David. Part of that focus came from his public profile. As a rising music artist with a growing fan base, his name was already familiar to millions. When reports began linking a vehicle connected to him to the location where Celeste Rivas was found, the case moved from local concern to national headlines almost instantly. But investigators weren't driven by fame, they were driven by proximity. According to publicly available information, authorities focused on David because of several overlapping factors. First, there was ownership or direct access to the vehicle in question. That alone did not imply guilt, but it placed him within the factual framework investigators had to examine. Second, timelines mattered. Investigators reportedly analyzed movements, locations, and windows of time to determine who had access to what and when. This is where a crucial distinction often gets lost. Being a person of interest is not the same as being charged with a crime. Early reporting, however, frequently blurred that line. Headlines collapsed nuance into implication, and online discussions often treated investigation focus as confirmation rather than inquiry. According to reports, David initially cooperated with authorities. That cooperation included speaking with investigators and allowing aspects of his situation to be reviewed. At that stage, there were still no charges and no public declaration of criminal responsibility. But as the investigation progressed, another shift occurred. David retained high-profile legal counsel. This move sparked speculation online, but legal experts consistently note that retaining counsel, especially in a high-profile case, is a standard protective step, not an admission of wrongdoing. As scrutiny intensified, the legal strategy around the case became more visible, signaling that investigators were no longer treating the situation as routine. Meanwhile, public reaction accelerated faster than facts. Social media platforms filled gaps with assumptions. Fan communities fractured. Media amplification turned partial information into viral narratives, often without context. Each new detail, verified or not, was dissected in real time. But investigators weren't focused on headlines. They were focused on inconsistencies, timelines that didn't align cleanly, and unanswered questions that still lingered beneath the surface. And it was those unresolved details, not public pressure, that continued to push the investigation forward. One of the most misunderstood aspects of this case is not what investigators said, but what they didn't say. From the outside, the delay felt unsettling. Weeks passed, then months, and yet no immediate criminal charges followed the discovery of Celeste Rivas. For many observers, that silence was interpreted as hesitation, uncertainty, or even weakness in the case. But according to publicly available reporting, the delay was rooted in forensic reality. Investigators were facing a significant gap between the time Celeste was last seen and the moment her body was recovered. That time gap matters more than most people realize. It affects evidence integrity, limits biological conclusions, and complicates the ability to establish precise timelines. The condition of the evidence itself also presented challenges. When remains are discovered after an extended period, standard forensic markers, such as exact time of death or definitive cause, can be far more difficult to determine. Environmental exposure, movement of the body, and degradation all introduce variables that cannot be rushed or simplified. That's why one document became central to everything that followed: the medical examiner's report. According to reports, those findings were sealed. That meant investigators could review them, but the public could not. Media outlets were left to speculate, often filling the absence of information with interpretation rather than fact. This created a dangerous perception gap. Many assumed that a lack of public detail meant a lack of evidence. In reality, sealed findings often indicate the opposite, that information exists, but releasing it prematurely could compromise the investigation or future legal proceedings. Authorities reportedly waited not because they lacked direction, but because forensic conclusions had to meet a specific legal threshold. Any determination about manner of death needed to be defensible, precise, and supported by expert consensus. This is where patience becomes part of the process. The forensic report wasn't just another step, it was the foundation. Without it, investigators could not escalate the case responsibly. With it, everything changed, and the silence surrounding those findings, misread by the public for months, would later take on an entirely different meaning. Because that silence wasn't empty, it was building towards something investigators were not yet ready to reveal. The turning point in this case didn't come with a dramatic press conference or a sudden arrest. It came quietly, through a series of carefully worded reports that signaled a major change behind the scenes. Outlets including TMZ, MSN, AOL, and Fox LA began reporting the same development from different angles. Prosecutors were now seriously considering a grand jury. That detail matters more than many people realize. A grand jury is not a trial. It does not determine guilt or innocence. Instead, it serves one specific purpose: to decide whether there is enough evidence for formal criminal charges to move forward. The process happens largely out of public view, and the standard of proof is lower than at trial, but still significant. In other words, a grand jury signals that prosecutors believe the evidence may now meet a legal threshold that didn't exist before. So what changed? According to reports citing sources familiar with the investigation, several factors appear to have converged. One involves the continued review of forensic findings that were previously sealed. Another involves witness testimony that was either unavailable earlier or reevaluated once timelines and evidence were aligned more clearly. There are also indications of a strategic shift on the prosecution side. Cases like this often evolve slowly. Early uncertainty gives way to structure as evidence is tested. cross-checked, and legally stress-tested. What may not appear actionable at one stage can become compelling once corroborated from multiple angles. Importantly, none of these reports accuse or convict anyone. They describe process, not outcome. Legal analysts note that prosecutors do not pursue grand juries lightly, especially in cases that have already drawn public scrutiny. Doing so means they are prepared to present evidence under oath and argue that criminal charges are justified under the law. That alone represents a fundamental shift from where the case began. What was once described as unclear and unclassified is now being re-examined through a criminal lens. Language has changed, framing has changed, and the involvement of a grand jury suggests the investigation has moved into a far more serious phase. This is the moment when a case stops being open-ended and starts narrowing, not toward a conclusion, but toward accountability. And this is where the case quietly crossed a line. The language surrounding this case has changed, and that shift is impossible to ignore. Recent reporting from multiple outlets now describes the possibility of an indictment as likely, not hypothetical. According to sources cited by TMZ, MSN, AOL, and Fox LA, prosecutors are actively preparing for the possibility of formal charges, including a potential murder charge connected to the death of Celeste Rivas. But it's important to pay attention not just to what is being reported, rather how it's being reported. Officials and sources close to the case are using careful, deliberate wording. Terms like likely, according to sources, and under consideration appear repeatedly. That caution is not accidental. It reflects both the seriousness of the potential charge and the legal responsibility prosecutors carry before moving forward. As of now, no official charge has been filed. That distinction matters. In cases involving severe allegations, especially those that could result in life-altering consequences, prosecutors are required to meet an exceptionally high standard before acting. This is not just about having evidence, it's about having evidence that can withstand intense scrutiny in court. Legal experts often point out that once a murder charge is filed, there is no room for retreat. The case becomes public, adversarial, and permanent. Every piece of evidence will be challenged. Every procedural decision will be examined. That's why caution defines this phase. According to reporting, authorities are continuing to evaluate timelines, forensic conclusions, and witness accounts in order to present a cohesive narrative, one that does not rely on speculation or assumption. The goal is not speed, but certainty. This careful approach has frustrated some observers who want immediate resolution, but from a legal perspective, delay can be a sign of precision rather than indecision. What's clear is that the tone has shifted. What was once framed as uncertain is now being discussed as prosecutable. What was once open-ended is now narrowing toward a defined legal outcome. Still, officials remain restrained. They are not announcing conclusions. They are not making public accusations. They are letting the process unfold step by step, because once a charge is filed, there is no turning back. As this case evolved, two very different stories began unfolding at the same time. One played out online, the other unfolded inside legal offices, courtrooms, and sealed documents. On social media, conclusions formed quickly. Timelines were simplified. Fragments of information were treated as final answers. In comment sections and viral posts, certainty appeared long before the legal process ever caught up. But the legal reality moved at a very different pace. While online discussions leaned toward absolutes, investigators and prosecutors remained cautious. Every step required verification. Every conclusion needed to be supported, documented, and defensible under law. This gap between public perception and legal procedure created tension and confusion. Social media accelerated everything. Short clips, headlines without context, and speculation-driven threads spread faster than verified information. Algorithms rewarded emotional reactions, not accuracy. As a result, unconfirmed claims often traveled further than official statements. That's where the danger lies. Premature judgment doesn't just affect public opinion, it can influence witnesses, contaminate testimony, and complicate legal proceedings. In high-profile cases, misinformation can become an obstacle investigators have to work around, not just correct. This is why legal systems operate with restraint. Presumption of innocence is not a technicality, it's a foundation. Authorities cannot act on viral narratives or emotional pressure. They must rely on facts, evidence, and procedure, even when public sentiment pushes for faster answers. This case highlights that tension clearly. Online, many people speak as if the outcome is already decided. Legally, however, Nothing is final until it's formally charged, argued, and tested in court. That disconnect creates frustration, but it also protects the integrity of the process. Ad-safe reporting means acknowledging that difference without amplifying speculation. It means separating verified developments from interpretation, and it means understanding that legal silence often exists to preserve fairness, not to hide truth. This is where many high-profile cases go wrong. When narrative overtakes nuance and certainty replaces evidence, the pursuit of truth becomes harder, not easier. Despite everything that has unfolded so far, this story is not over. What we're witnessing is a case still in motion, one shaped by timelines, legal thresholds, and decisions that cannot be rushed without consequences. While reporting now suggests that charges may be approaching, the courtroom has not yet had its say, and until it does, conclusions remain provisional. That restraint matters. High-profile cases often invite certainty long before facts are fully tested, but the legal process exists precisely to slow that impulse down, to separate assumption from evidence and narrative from proof. Waiting is not weakness. It's part of ensuring accountability is real, not reactionary. There's also a broader impact worth acknowledging. Beyond legal outcomes, cases like this affect families, communities, and public trust in institutions meant to deliver justice fairly. Every delay, every leak, and every viral claim shapes perception, sometimes in ways that can't be undone. That's why how we consume these stories matters as much as how they're investigated. This case challenges us to sit with uncertainty, to follow developments without turning speculation into verdicts, and to remember that fairness doesn't disappear just because emotions run high. As new information emerges, the most responsible approach is patience, allowing facts to surface through process, not pressure. If you want to stay informed as this story continues to evolve, subscribe for verified updates and careful breakdowns. In the next video, we'll take a closer look at the legal mechanics behind indictments, what they mean, how they work, and why they're often misunderstood. Until then, one question remains worth asking: how do we balance accountability with fairness before the facts are fully known?